second reading is from Acts. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind. It filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as a fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability.
예루살렘에는 세계 각 나라에서 온 경건한 유대인들이 머물고 있었습니다. 이 말소리가 나자 많은 군중들이 모여들었습니다. 그들은 믿는 사람들이 자기네 나라 말로 말하는 것을 듣고 모두 놀랐습니다. 군중들은 너무나 놀라 이상히 여기며 말했습니다. 보시오, 말을 하는 사람들은 모두 갈릴리 사람들이 아닙니까? 그런데 우리가 이 사람들이 저마다 우리가 사는 지방 말을 하는 것을 듣게 되니 이것이 도대체 어찌된 일입니까?
Partos y medos y elamitos y los que habitamos en Mesopotamia, en Judea y en Capadocia, en el Ponto y en Asia, en Frigia y en Pamfilia, en Egipto y en las partes de África que está de la otra parte de Cirene, y romanos extranjeros, tanto judíos como convertidos, cretenses y árabes, les oímos hablar en nuestras lenguas las maravillas de Dios, y estaban todos atónitos y perplejos, diciendo los unos a los otros, ¿qué quiere ser esto? Mas otros burlándose decían que están llenos de mosto.
Lekin patras, ungyar kesat karahua, apni awaz, banan karki logan sekhaha, ki al yaburio, al Yerushalayim, kesat raniwala, ji yam, al khan lagakar, Mary Bantev Suno. Ki jaisa tun samjate, ki nashne min mahi, kyunki abhi topha, ki din chadar hai. Baki yiwu bathai, jo yoel nabi kima marita kahi gyam hai. Ki. Huda farmata hai, ka akiri dinon men asakota. Ki main apni ru, men sehar vashar har dalunga. Aur tumhara jawan roya. Aur tumhara bude khwab dekhenge.
Und auf meine Knechte und auf meine Mägde will ich in jenen Tagen von meinem Geist ausgießen. Und sie sollen Weissagen. Und ich will Wunder tun oben am Himmel und Zeichen unten auf der Erde. Blut und Feuer und Rauchdampf. Die Sonne soll sich verkehren in Finsternis und der Mond in Blut, ehe denn der große Tag der Offenbarung des Herrn ist. Und soll geschehen, wer der Name des Herrn anrufen wird, soll gerettet werden.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So usually, when we read the story of Pentecost, we got two big problems. The first problem is trying to pronounce all these names. Because whether you read them in English or in any other language, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, that's always really hard and really weird, and it can get in the way of figuring out what's actually going on in this story. But the second problem that we usually have is that when we hear this story about the Holy Spirit coming upon the disciples and the flames on top of their heads and the way they were able to be heard in all kinds of other languages, it reinforces this notion that many of us have, that gifts of the Holy Spirit are strange, ecstatic, mystical kinds of gifts that defy all explanation and often the rules and laws of physics and nature and everything else. So it leads us to sort of say, well, you know what? If I had mystical abilities, if the Spirit gave me some kind of bizarre thing, if I could walk around with a flame on my head, well then I could do all kinds of crazy things too, and it would be great and I would make a difference. But that doesn't happen to me, probably doesn't happen to you, and so it's tempting to listen to the story and say, well, this doesn't have much to do with us. Here's the thing, though, about the story of Pentecost. The story of Pentecost is really not about the disciples or about the gifts that the disciples have. Because after all that they do is get off of their butts, walk outside the house, and they talk. And they talk about the stuff that they already know. The really miraculous thing about Pentecost is what God does with their regular gifts when they're willing to use them. That's the thing that really happens at Pentecost, because although Luke says the disciples went outside and they spoke in all these other languages, the sense really is that they just spoke the language that they knew. And everybody else was somehow empowered to hear in their own language, in the language most accessible to them. It really was like the Holy Spirit behaving like Google Translate. It translated to everybody else these mighty deeds of God. And we read this and we think, well, that's because they had special, deep, spiritual understanding of the mighty deeds of God. But you know what they were talking about? They were talking about the mighty deed of God, the resurrection of Jesus. It was something they knew and they had experienced. They just talked about it. And God was able to do something great, something life-changing in people's lives, when they were willing simply to take the gifts they had and to use them. So the story of Pentecost really is about the disciples learning, or at least they should have learned, that God can do miraculous things with them whenever they are willing to be able to be disciples of Jesus who, first of all, stick together. The story begins with the disciples saying, with the saying that the disciples are all together in one place. They're all together. I don't think that that is an accidental or incidental part of the story. The disciples were called by Jesus to stick together, pray together, work together, and that's what they're doing when the Holy Spirit comes in power among them. They can do great things when they are together. And even though it is the case that the disciples later on do things individually and in small groups, it is still the case that the fact that they are connected to one another, that they feel that connection, they know the rest of them have their back, that's what gives them the strength and the courage to go out and do the things that God calls them to do. And even though they never walk around again with flames of fire on their head, and we never hear a story again about them speaking and other people hearing in a different language, that sense of connection they have to one another, that sticking together, that being drawn together by the Spirit, is what empowers them to do the things that God calls them to do. What the disciples are really supposed to learn on that day of Pentecost is that when they stick together, they're also called to be people who just use their regular old gifts. You never hear the disciples anywhere recorded complaining about, boy, back then, when the tongue of fire came upon my head and I could talk to people in all kinds of languages, boy, if God would give that to me again, then I could do something. They just went out and did what they felt called to do, using the gifts and talents and opportunities that they had. And they started to realize that God could take anything, even their regular old walk down the street, and do amazing things with it when they were willing to take their gifts and talents that they already had and put them to good use. And when they did those things, they did one other thing. They figured that the point of God using their regular gifts was not simply to impart knowledge about God to other people. They thought, and they knew, or they should have learned, that the purpose of the Spirit in their lives was to help people have an actual living experience of the resurrection of Jesus. Their job, their purpose, was to help people actually experience God, not just know about God. Because here's the thing. The day of Pentecost, as the name implies, the first part of that, Pent 50. So it's a celebration, it's a Jewish celebration of 50 days after Passover. So this is 50 days after the resurrection, and they're all still in Jerusalem. Thing is, after 50 days in Jerusalem, rumors had spread all over the place about this guy Jesus who was crucified. People said he had been raised from the dead. It probably was all, people knew the information. They had heard it. What they hadn't had was an experience of the resurrection. And what happened on the day of Pentecost was that people who had never met Jesus, had never seen Jesus, had never witnessed the resurrection, somehow through what the disciples were able to say and do and their attitude, the way they conveyed it, people came away and saying, wow, we've actually experienced God in our lives, we actually somehow in some way experienced Jesus' presence through these disciples. That was the goal of the Spirit coming upon the disciples that day. It was not to simply impart knowledge about God. It was not to show how spiritual or how good they particularly were. It was to help people who had not had an experience of God have a real, living, life-changing experience of Jesus in their lives. And that's why I think that the story of Pentecost is important for us too. Because too often we get caught up thinking that spiritual gifts are supposed to be these mystical abilities, and we're supposed to have tongues of flame on our head, and we're supposed to be able to do kind of wild, bizarre things that defy the laws of nature and all that kind of stuff, which is probably why so few Lutherans actually want to talk about the Holy Spirit, because every time we have those conversations, that's usually where we end up going. But the story of Pentecost really shows us that the power of the Spirit in our lives is also God's action in our lives to draw us together, to help us to stick together, to help us to be a community that can do God's work in the world. And that is nowhere, to me, more evident than when we get near yard sale, because that's where we really need 150 people to actually pull this thing off. And it is often the case that many of the things that we do best, we do only because we do them together. But even at those times, and this is what happens a lot of the time around here, where I really think, in order to do some work that we need to do, we really need about 10 people doing it. But we can't find 10 people. So we got 3 people who are going to overfunction, and they're just going to plow through, and somehow they manage to get it done. But they only manage to get it done because somehow those folks also feel the backing, the support, the connection to the whole rest of the community. It's when we are drawn together, when we are connected to one another, just like those first disciples, that God can work through us. Whether we're in a big group, a small group, or even by ourselves. That's the power of the Spirit working in our lives. The power of the Spirit working in our lives is also the power to call us to be people who are able to just take our regular gifts and say, you know what, even if I just think this is a normal gift, or just a regular interest of mine, if I'm willing to employ that somehow in the things that God calls me to do, God can do remarkable things, even if it doesn't seem like a big deal to me. And I feel this way every time that we do Habitat for Humanity, because I think I have always signed up and gone on the Habitat days, because if you give me a chance to play with tools, I will go and I will play with tools. It's fun. I like it. It's an interest, and I'm good at it. Thing is, a lot of times when I go to Habitat, most of the things they have us do are things that don't really require the really good skill sets that I have developed. Although last time, do not count on this, last time they actually let me cut, trim, and molding and do angled cuts, which they don't usually let you do unless you're good at that, because you can cost them a lot of money that way. But I got to do it, and it was cool, and it was fun, but most of the time I'm just thinking, well, I like doing this, it's fun, I enjoy it, so I'm going and doing it, so why is that a big deal? And in itself, it's not. What is a big deal is what God can do with our regular interests and talents. Because a bunch of people who just take the regular interests and talents and they go and they do that, end up making it possible for people without housing to have housing. It actually makes God's love a physical, tangible event in other people's lives. And it happens not because any of us have, incredible skill sets, but because God can take our regular efforts and our regular interests and do something extraordinary with them. And most importantly, what the power of the Spirit is about in our lives is also giving us the ability to actually help people have a living experience of Jesus in their lives. That was and is fundamentally the purpose of the church. Sometimes we think that Jesus calls us together so that we can kind of be spiritually strengthened, and we should do good works, and we should tell people about God, and all that's fine and it's good. But see, people in Jerusalem, they knew about good works, and they knew about God, but they didn't have a living experience of God. Sometimes we get so caught up in the stuff that we're supposed to do, or the stuff that we enjoy doing or whatever, that we forget that what Jesus is really calling us together to do is to be a community and individuals who, through our words, through our actions, through our attitudes, actually convey a sense of God's presence to other people who have not felt the presence of God in their life. What the first disciples were able to do was help people experience the resurrection as a real event in their lives, not just the information about it. And that's still what Jesus calls us to be about as well. Because the real miracle of Pentecost is not the flame and it's not the wind. The miracle of Pentecost wasn't that the disciples suddenly turned into people that they hadn't been before. The miracle wasn't even that people could hear in all kinds of different languages. The real miracle of Pentecost was that people who had not seen or met Jesus came to experience the resurrection of Jesus not as a rumor, but as a living event in their lives. The miracle of Pentecost was that people who thought of God as an idea started to experience God as a living force of love in their lives. The real miracle of Pentecost was that people who thought that God was far off had an experience of God's nearness and closeness right here and right now. That was the miracle that the first disciples experienced and participated in on that day of Pentecost. That's what the miracle of the church is about, that the Holy Spirit creates. And that is the miracle that God calls us to participate even today.